Now, why do that? Well, the thing is, you have to look at the private sector debt. You have to look at individual debt. If I owe a lot of money and I have to pay it back, well, in the course of paying it back, I'm not spending it, am I? And so it's that deleveraging, it's that paying off the debt that from the individual up to the government level, except the government's not, that is depressing spending. So you can't, with the deleveraging, you don't get the consumption. Without the consumption, you don't get the growth, you don't get the taxes. You just cannot get there from here. By the way, that 42 trillion, 3 times 14, is grossly understated, because that's only like debt where you actually borrowed it and signed a note and issued some liability. If you throw on contingent liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, student loans, FHA, Federal Home Loan Bank System, I could keep going, but you get the point. Throw all that in, the number is in excess of $100 trillion. So that's where we are. So now let's talk just briefly about the euro. And the point there is there was massive confusion and misguided policy in Europe about the difference between the currency and the debt. Unfortunately, we're in a place where the market thinks they're the same, which is if you're a sovereign borrower in euros, somehow the quality of the euro is a function of the quality of that debt. Now, there's no reason for that to be true. Think of the United States. If a corporation goes bankrupt, Enron goes bankrupt, nobody thinks that that calls the dollar into question. Just because they borrowed in dollars, they can default. That doesn't make the dollar a bad currency. It just means that they were a bad borrower. So why can't you look at Greece and say, hey, Greece, we know you borrowed in euros, but that's your problem. You got to pay off the debt. The fact that it's denominated in euros doesn't mean anything relative to your capacity to pay the debt. Well, that's not what has happened. That could have happened, but it didn't. What's happened is that these things have become conflated in the eyes of the market and the eyes of policymakers to the point where a euro sovereign default will be considered the equivalent of repudiating the euro, and that's not something Germany wants to see. So on top of everything else I described, we have that particular problem. And I'll just give you a snapshot of Europe. I realize this is too small to read, but you'll get the materials and you can study this as you like. But what you can see clearly is, the red are the critical cases, Ireland, Portugal, Greece. The orange are problematic, may get to a critical stage. The lighter colors up to the yellow are financially sound, at least for the time being. And what you have is a very obvious core periphery type of problem. If you think about how empires collapse, they collapse at the periphery, at least initially. And if you think of how other empires conquer and expand, they expand at the periphery. So here you've got sort of a classic case, almost like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Not clear how this is going to play out. There are a couple different ways. Germany could rescue everybody, but they're not going to do that for free. I think you'll see some very coercive terms. Oh, you want to bail out? Fine, but your bondholders are going to have to take a haircut. You're going to have to get your fiscal house in order. We're going to have centralized fiscal policy, with Germany calling the shots. So almost like a fourth Reich, a fourth financial Reich in Europe. That's one way of resolving this. Germany wants the euro, by the way. They benefit a lot from the euro because their exports are very competitive in Europe. I mean, leave aside the rest of the world. And the fact that the euro is collapsing relative to other currencies also helps them because it helps them pick up market share in China and North America. So a unified but declining euro is a twofer for Germany. They dominate their home market and get market share around the world. But there's a kind of a price to pay for that, and we'll see how much tolerance the German people actually have for that. But that's kind of one way out. The other way out are just the collapse of the euro and maybe a retreat to a core euro area, which might be Germany, Austria, Finland, the Netherlands. There are 4 or 5 countries that could probably go it alone and still have a valuable currency, but that's kind of the issue they're facing. Now, I said before that this debt is not going to be repaid. It cannot be repaid. So how do you get out of that? Well, there are actually several classic ways of defaulting, and let's put default in quotation marks. There's the outright default, so I'm just not going to pay you, right? That would probably happen in a deflationary collapse where the economy, we're back to the Great Depression and people just don't pay. And that is what happened in the Great Depression. The great debt crisis of the 20s and 30s had to do with World War I reparations imposed on Germany as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Now, you're pretty familiar with that, but Germany owed the money to Britain and France in reparations, totally unpayable. There was no way Germany ever could have repaid that, at least not without a lot more sacrifice than they were prepared to make. But France and England had war debts to the United States. We funded them regular way by buying their bonds. They then imposed that debt on Germany by way of reparations. So Germany couldn't pay Britain and France. Without the reparations, Britain and France could not pay the United States. In the deflationary collapse of the 1930s, that debt was not repaid. President Hoover issued a moratorium on war debts in 1929, but as a quid pro quo, he insisted that the British and French put a moratorium on reparations as well, and then that was sort of buying time. At the end of the day, none of that debt was repaid. So there's your deflationary collapse where you just don't pay. The other way out is confiscatory taxation. So I pay you, but I'm the government, so here's your money, but there's a 90% tax. Give it back. Thank you very much. Third way out is an inflationary default, a hyperinflation. So I owe you $1 trillion. Here's your trillion. Good luck buying a loaf of bread, because I printed all the money. Just print the money and give it to you, and it's not worth anything, but I paid you back, right? So deflation, confiscatory taxation, and hyperinflation are three ways out. So when I said it won't be repaid, I mean that in real terms. In nominal terms, it may be repaid in greatly debased currency, and that's what we should expect. Or maybe some combination of the above. Now, I'm a big fan of Neil Young, and somebody once criticized Neil Young and said, all your songs sound alike. And Neil Young turned around and said, well, it's all one song. And when you think about the debt crisis, you look at Dubai, you look at Greece, you look at Ireland, you're like, these have similar characteristics. And my message tonight is, it's all one crisis. This is a global sovereign debt crisis. Nobody can pay. It's just a matter of time before all those chips fall. We'll see how that plays out. So what happens in the short run? What happens while we're waiting for this scenario to play out? The answer is you have currency wars, and a currency war has broken out. When the pie is expanding, when global growth is, when the economy is growing, people don't worry too much about trade advantage. They're like, hey, you got a little edge on me, or I think you're being a little, sketchy with your exchange rate, but it's okay, because I'm making enough money, my people are happy, the pie's growing, it's fine, even though I don't like it. But when the pie's shrinking, people fight over crumbs, because there's not enough to go around, particularly with a debt overhang. And so it's in precisely these deflationary, declining growth scenarios where the currency wars break out, because that's the way to get an edge on your opponent. And just to flip to the next slide, you all learned this in your first week of macroeconomics, but definition of GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, exports minus imports. And that's all there is. I mean, it's a tautology, it's a definition, but that's it. Now, the problem today is that consumption is flat or declining because of the personal deleveraging I described. Investment, a little pickup last year, but that's starting to flatten out a little bit, because think of it, you're a businessman. Are you going to invest in plant and equipment when the end user isn't buying your stuff? Probably not. Government spending, that was the big thing in 2009. That $1 trillion of government spending got us through 2009 and 2010. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But now there's a backlash between the Tea Party and the Republicans taking the House. Fiscal policy, I would have said it's off the table until last night, 6 o'clock last night. We learned that we're going to get, this is really the fourth stimulus, because President Bush had one, President Obama had two, and this is now the fourth in this bipartisan series of stimulus. I like the compromise. Republicans wanted tax cuts for the rich. Obama wanted tax cuts for the poor, and they said tax cuts for everybody, but no spending cuts to go with it. So I actually, I think tax cuts are good. I think it will help the economy, but without the spending cuts, you're just making the problem that I just described worse. So this is where your currency wars break out, because when C, I, and G aren't doing it for you, you go to net exports. Net exports is the only thing that can drive an economy when consumption, investment, and government spending are not doing it. And how do you get your exports up? You debase, you cut your currency, you devalue your currency. And this is why currency wars, beggar thy neighbor, devaluations, break out in times of economic stagnation, because that's the only way I can get an edge. The problem, of course, is that everyone's trying to cut against everyone else all at the same time, and it cannot be done. We can't devalue against Mars. So This happened in the Great Depression. It's happening again. I'm continually amazed that people say, well, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the 30s. Well, that's a good sentiment. I've yet to see a policy or a development that doesn't exactly mirror the 1920s and the 1930s, which suggests to me that what I said at the beginning about the car, there's a dynamic going on that your policy isn't going to change. So we're kind of dealing with that. So when net exports are the only source of growth, that's when currency wars begin. Here's a couple things. Think of it in strategic terms, maybe tactical terms, actually. All advantage is temporary. So I devalue against you, but next week you devalue against me, and so whatever edge I got, it goes away pretty quickly. Escalation is inevitable because it is a zero or negative sum game, and so the only way to get an edge is to do more of it. Escalation includes, I say escalation is inevitable. I'm reminded of President Eisenhower's comment that if you can't solve a problem, enlarge the problem, make the problem bigger. He meant it in a positive sense of getting a bigger scope on things, but here it's in the negative sense of just continuing the escalation. Escalation includes capital controls. So you think my currency is undervalued, you want to invest in my economy and buy property in my country, fine, I'm putting up gates. They're not tariffs, they're capital controls. You can't come in. Or if you come into my economy, you can't get out. You're here for a long time. We haven't seen that really since the 70s and the early 80s. They're coming back in a small way. I think that'll get bigger. Currency wars lead very quickly to trade wars. You know what that's about. Gold plays a role. We'll talk some more about that. And then ultimately shooting wars, which is what happened in the 1930s after, when Germany devalued against France and Germany refused to pay reparations to France. France invaded the Ruhr Valley and said, what we lawyers call self-help. They just started stripping the coal and the steel and the fat, literally putting on railroad cars and sending it back to France. Germany was defenseless, and their Chancellor Hitler said we ought to rearm, and we know how that played out. So that's how these things go. The political backlash against the bailouts, not just in the United States, but globally, in these sovereign debt bailouts is beginning, and it's getting stronger. And the instructive case is Iceland versus Ireland. Two relatively small economies, both broke. Iceland just outright defaulted. They took the "we're not paying you" solution. Their economy collapsed. Unemployment went up. Their currency was discredited. They were the outcasts of the world. But guess what? Today, Iceland has one of the highest growth rates of any economy because the good thing about hitting bottom is you got nowhere to go but up. Their currency is so cheap. Tourism is up. Exports are up. Employment is growing. The great thing about defaulting on your debt is you default on your debt. You don't have to pay it, and you leave it behind you. Your net worth actually goes up. It becomes your creditor's problem. So that's what Iceland did. Ireland is playing ball. Ireland's in the euro. They're getting a euro bailout. They're bailing out the banks. They're not writing off the debt. But let me show you a quick clip to give you some sense of what's going on. You know that in addition to national parliaments, there's a European Parliament. This is a member of the European Parliament about 2 weeks ago.
Mr. Co-President Nigel Farage, freedom and democracy.
Well, good morning, Mr. Van Rompuy. You've been in office for 1 year, and in that time, the whole edifice is beginning to crumble. There's chaos. The money's running out. I should thank you. You should perhaps be the pin-up boy of the Eurosceptic movement. But just look around this chamber this morning. Just look at these faces. Look at the fear. Look at the anger. Poor old Barroso here looks like he's seen a ghost. They're beginning to understand that the game is up. And yet, in their desperation to preserve their dream, they want to remove any remaining traces of democracy from the system. And it's pretty clear that none of you have learned anything. When you yourself, Mr. Van Rompuy, say that the euro has brought us stability, I suppose I could applaud you for having a sense of humour, but isn't this really just the bunker mentality? Your fanaticism is out in the open. You talked about the fact that it was a lie to believe that the nation state could exist in a 21st century globalised world. Well, that may be true in the case of Belgium, who haven't had a government for 6 months, but for the rest of us, right across every member state in this union, and perhaps this is why we see the fear in the faces, increasingly people are saying, we don't want that flag, we don't want the anthem, We don't want this political class. We want the whole thing consigned to the dustbin of history. And we had the Greek tragedy earlier on this year, and now we have